wanted to, welcome everyone to KSB's third and final installment of the Love Where You Live educational series. Today, we're going to be talking about pollinators. Our subject is pollinators of the bee's knees, and that's in celebration of National Pollinator Week this week.
Right.
We've had 2 talks already in our series in April and May about recycling and composting. And I will introduce myself. I'm Julie Barwick. I'm the director for Keep Smyrna Beautiful. And today we are joined by Gayle Evans. She has been a Cobb Master Gardener for 12 years. She loves native plants and perennials. Her home garden focuses on those types of plants as well as pollinators. And so we're really thrilled to have Gayle with us tonight. We have some questions already kind of planned that we'll ask you. But if anyone participating has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll be happy to get to them towards the end. All right, so we'll start off pretty basic, pretty easy with just kind of giving us an intro into what is a pollinator and what are some examples of pollinators that we might find.
Yes. Thank you, Julie. And again, I apologize for being late. As you can see, I'm sitting in my car and had my times wrong, but I am so glad to be here and represent the Cobb County Master Gardeners. And pollinators are truly one of my favorite. I don't want to call them an animal because they're not necessarily animals. I don't want to call them a reptile. A lot of them are insects, but one of my favorites in the environment, and truly, hopefully, you'll find out why as we have a discussion in a few minutes. But, pollinators are insects. They can be birds. This time of the year, a hummingbird is a great example of a pollinator. It can be worms. It can be, let's see, what else? We're not an intentional pollinator, but I guess, and I don't say it, I say it in a candid sort of way, but I guess if we kind of are out in the garden and we are working in the flowers and happen to get a little pollen on our finger and move it over to another plant, we could be a pollinator, but you're really looking at your insects, your bees, your wasp, your ants are good pollinators. Your beetles to some degree. Those are your pollinators in addition to the birds that we think about.
Okay, great. So we hear a lot about pollinators. What makes them so important?
So what pollinators do, Julie, and group, is they actually take the pollen of one plant and transfer it to another plant purely because they are using the bloom, and the pollen, of course, is inside of the bloom of the plant, and they go through and they actually it's the birds and the bees, literally the birds and the bees, in pollinating to create our vegetables, our fruits, anything where there has to be the male and female contact in a flower or a tree, or any other type of plant, specifically your native plants are some of the things that we'll talk about in a minute. But they transfer pollen from one plant to another or one bloom to another through, and so that there can be that process of multiplying, I guess is the word I'm trying to use.
Great. So what environment is hospitable to pollinators?
Well, it's interesting. And when I think about pollinators, and I'm sitting here looking at a grassy field, so it is at this time of the year, it is not a place for pollinators, but you can find pollinators in hot, dry heat like we have right now. One of my favorite native or one of my favorite perennials is Miss Huff Lantana. Miss Huff Lantana loves the dry heat, the hot sun, and some of our pollinators will like the shade or part shade. Some of our pollinators will like a bog where it's nice and wet. The cardinal flower is one of those where it likes partial sun and a little bit of wetness. So really all of your environments, you just really um, have to think about what that pollinator is. And really another thing is different times of the year, the pollinator itself is going to be looking for different environments. So if it's looking to breed, it may be looking at one environment. And, we think about the carpenter bee as being a pollinator. They're, of course, boring in our wood of our homes and what have you. And they actually will stay from the early spring through when we do not see them, and that is July for bearing their offspring. So it really kind of depends on which pollinator we're looking at. Today, we would probably think about butterflies for this time of the year. We would think about the wasps. So, they're going to still be looking for water, just like any other animal on the planet would. They're going to be looking for that food source. They're going to be looking for, the various temperatures, depending on, where they are located in say, the United States or in Georgia or in Cobb County. So it will really depend. You can probably find pollinators in all of the environments, especially in our community.
Okay, great. I mean, just building off of that, kind of what are some of the main ones that we might find here, like in Smyrna or Cobb County?
Pollinators, okay. Of course, the butterfly. And really, I think that as I talk about the pollinators, we have to think of these as being good insects, better insects than we oftentimes give them credit for. So you've got your butterflies, you've got your hummingbirds, you've got your ants. Your ants are excellent pollinators. Your bees. And one thing that I want to mention as we get further along is I want to talk about the honeybee. But so your bees, I don't know if I said wasp or not. So all of these are pollinators that we could walk through our garden or our landscape and basically look to see if we have any this time of the year.
Okay. All right. Do pollinators, so you mentioned food, water. Is there anything else the pollinators might need?
I'm glad you asked me that question because I was just sitting here thinking, pollinators need a place to breed. We talked about the birds and the bees and the fact that they do need to breed. So they need a place to breed. And sometimes I'll start talking about pollinator plants. And please forgive me if it sounds like I'm talking about a plant because I really am. But, pollinators themselves, your birds, your bees, your ants, your insects, and what have you, they need a place to breed. And not only do they need a place to breed, but they need a food source for their young. So, especially here again, this time of the year, you're talking about butterflies or even some of your other insects. They're looking for places to grow their young. So they've got to have the habitat to grow their young, and then they've got to have a food source for their young. So that's really important. And then water. We don't think about insects as needing water, but they need water just like we as humans need water. And especially with the heat, if it's outside of what is normally our temperature range for a particular time of the year, when they're in this environment, they need the water to replenish.
Okay, great. So are there any things that we can do to like provide those different sources, like a breeding space, water? Obviously food would be the plants, as I'm guessing, and then but like, how do we provide those? Is there a way that we can provide those things?
Absolutely. One of the things that you can do, and I'm going to kind of refer to butterflies more than anything because I think that's something that we can really look at and measure. But if you wanted to take a saucer and put it in your backyard, and put it so that maybe it's not in full sun, maybe there's a bit of shade, so there is some coolness there for some of your pollinators, and then take and put a rock on the plate, or any sort of ceramic shallow dish, and then take that dish and put water in it so that you use the rock so that the pollinator insect, as an example, can sit and perch on that dry surface and actually partake of the water. There are instances where they may say take a rotten or take an orange and just cut it in wedges and put it in the water and just let it deteriorate. So that gives them sort of a source of food, or the other nutrients that they may need to for their young or for themselves or whatever. So that's a good example. Nesting materials, um, you know, any sort of clippings or anything that you leave. I think you said you've talked about compost piles. If you've got the clippings in a compost pile, they're certainly going to take those things and identify those things and take them back to their nest. So I think just by virtue of having some of that sitting in your yard or your garden, then they are going to actually take that and take it back to their nest, based on wherever they are.
Okay, great. Um, so kind of in recent years, we've heard a lot about pollinators kind of being in danger. Why do you can you explain kind of why they are in danger and kind of what challenges they're facing?
Right, right. Excuse me. Well, we are cleaning our land of trees, and trees is one of the habitats for pollinators of varying kinds. And I always like to think about the hummingbird. I think there's a lot of buzz, not to be a pun, but there's a lot of buzz this summer about hummingbirds not as plentiful as they have been in the past.
Mhm.
Well, many hummingbirds build their nest in pine trees. So if you stop and think about the amount of land that we have cleared in our communities, it's breeding ground. The same thing with, say, the in-ground insects. We've cleared the land surface and it hasn't been built back, or the land surface has been taken over um, by grasses. And sometimes the grasses will cause them to not be able to get into the ground. And that's very important for them to have and to be able to see, um, to be able to get into the ground. So there's just different things like that that is important. I'm trying to think what else. Really, it's the stripping um, of the surfaces that they are accustomed to in their normal habitat. Also, we're losing a lot of our native plants, and we'll probably talk native plants in a minute. But we're losing a lot of our native plants in our communities through all of these things that we've mentioned. So all of these pieces, when you think about losing a place to grow your young, when you think about a place for water, and when you think about a place for a food source, that it in itself eliminates your habitat.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on native plants, great segue. So why are native plants kind of good for pollinators?
Native plants are good for pollinators because that is the normal uh, material that they would use as a food source. Now, we see hummingbirds, and I'll go back to hummingbirds. We see hummingbirds that come to our feeder. But if we think about it, hummingbirds can potentially be in a tree that's blooming, and we don't know that a particular native tree is blooming as a food source for them, as well as that nesting location. Um, we use native plants such as, and it's actually blooming this time of the year. It's the butterfly weed, and it's for the monarch butterfly. I always love to share this story. I'm in Northwest Cobb and on Mars Hill Road, and I've already seen it this year. We have a proliferation of butterfly weed. So as I'm driving on Mars Hill, I look for that subtle hint of orange. And that is the butterfly weed that's blooming. So, the butterflies are accustomed to this being available for them. And so they know the characteristics of it. Whereas if you have, some of the plants that may not be native, they can be invasive, which we have to be very careful with. And they actually will overshadow the native plants. So natives are just very good as a food source, as a fluid source, and as a place to grow their young, and they're accustomed to it.
Great. So is it okay to have, if I'm in my garden, is it okay to have non-native plants, or are there, should we be really focusing more on native plants?
Well, as a master gardener, I would always say, yes, we need to focus on native plants. But truth be told, there are some great plants that are non-native for the pollinators also. Some really good ones are the lantanas that are excellent sources. I spoke of the Miss Huff, which we see as a perennial, but lantana is a great one that the um, insects love, as well as the hummingbirds. So you really could use some of your annuals that are really good for your pollinators in your garden as well. You just want to be very careful with plants that are going to be invasive. And that's a question if you're going to a nursery and it's a nursery that has natives and non-natives, you want to ask that question. Is this going to spread? Is this going to be an invasive type plant? And then you make your decision from that information if you want that plant in your garden or not. I've actually had some native plants that I don't want in my garden. I have one right now, as a matter of fact, because because it's proliferating. And but you really have to understand how that plant is going to spread and if it is right for your environment.
Okay. Are there some common, like, plants that you see maybe like in gardens that are that people maybe think are good but are more of the invasive type? Is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head? Sorry.
That are the invasive type and that are not good.
Yeah, that are pretty
Let me,
common.
I'm sitting here trying to think. I'm sure when I'm in a nursery,
Yeah.
I typically watch that and watch how people will buy a particular plant. And as we talk, I'll go back and try to think about that.
Okay.
Many times what we don't realize is there's two different ways that new plants can grow from the existing plant that you buy in a nursery. Is number one, it's underground and it sends shoots underground. I've got a jack in a pulpit that does that now, and that's the one. It's a native plant, and it's I don't want to use the word invasive, but it multiplies prolifically,
Yeah.
which is different than being invasive. And then, you have plants like this one also that I'm mentioning, and they also multiply by seed. And a lot of times you don't really realize that there's a seed pod once that plant blooms. So if you choose to grow a plant like that, I think it's important to understand how to keep it from proliferating. Like with this particular jack in a pulpit, I could probably snap the blooms off um, so that the seed did not spread because it will literally go 20 feet from where it's originally planted. So you've just got to be able to understand that. And what I'm finding more and more, people that grow these types of plants will actually put them in pots.
Mhm.
And I have not had a tendency to do that myself, but I think understanding the growth pattern and the reproductive pattern of a plant and containing it if you need to. So, but I was trying to think of some that may be a little bit aggressive and that are not necessarily invasive, but I'll think for a minute and we can talk about that again.
Okay, great. So can I find native plants anywhere, like any nursery? Do I have to go to a specific one? Like where exactly can I find native plants?
Yes, and I'm going to mention some just kind of from our area.
Sure.
Um, there is my favorite, uh, which is Lost Mountain Nursery, out Dallas Highway. They have an excellent plant selection for pollinators. Also, another thing that I want to bring up in talking about nurseries, when we talk about pollinators and we talk about flowers or plants for pollinators, we're
Mhm.
not talking about something that solely blooms. A lot of your herbs, pollinators use to lay their eggs on. So those are the
Mm.
places where you find um, your eggs growing or being laid for, say, your butterflies, as an example. Fennel is another one. Dill is another one. So there's different types of herbs that the insects like, and it doesn't destroy the plant. And I think that's one thing to really understand. For a season of time, meaning once the caterpillars hatch, you may have some loss of your plant, but it will come back. So I think you have to understand that. Whereas, you know, your butterfly weed, you've got your bloom and the leaf of your plant that the monarch butterfly will use as part of its life cycle. So, but so I said Lost Mountain Nursery. Your big box stores, of course, have them. The quality of the plants are probably not as well sourced as some of your private. There's a place called Night Song Nursery. I think it's in Canton. And there's one other, Nearly Native, that's another one. But you can actually do a search on Google in the metro Atlanta area. There are others. Piedmont College is another one that has a botanical garden here locally. If you want to make a trip to Athens, the Athens Botanical Garden at different times of the year. And I will tell you, I will put a plug in for all of the Master Gardener plant sales because there are many. And I believe Chattahoochee Nature Center will have one in the fall. And you will see a lot of perennials and a lot of natives at those as well. But you have to get there early for those. But those are great places. I visited a center down in Perry, Georgia recently, and it was one of the places that had the bog setting and the shade and the sun, and so it had all of the habitat pieces. And I can't think of the name of it right now, but there are quite a few in the area. But I would have a tendency to stay away from a big box store and look for truly some of the locals.
Okay, great. So you kind of touched on it a little earlier, but I know some people, we've heard, grass is not good for pollinators, lawns are not good for pollinators. Can you kind of go a little bit more onto why that is the case?
Well, except for possibly providing some material to build a nest, there is nothing of value. There's not a bloom to have a food source. It's not going to provide any water. And if it is a pollinator that is going to go into a larva stage and go and bury itself underground, say during the winter,
Mhm.
you have it has a hard time, possibly depending on the insect, burrowing itself down in through the grass. So, and the grass will have a tendency through its root system and what have you to choke it out. So overall, it is just, there's nothing there for a pollinator from the grasses. So now I'm going to put a plug in though for the spring weeds. And when we see our dandelions and our little yellow flowers that we consider weeds in the springtime, many of those are native plants, and we don't realize that. And so those are excellent pollinators. And I have had to take a step back over the last 5 years and really understand what those potentially are. And you need to think, have a second thoughts about possibly removing those from your landscape.
Okay, great. So if I was looking to establish a garden that really wanted to be a good habitat for pollinators, are there any challenges that I might run into?
I think the main thing is just understanding what kind of climate you have and have in your landscape, and therefore you're wanting to do a garden, and what types of plants would be appropriate for that. I also think just by virtue of planting a pollinator garden is not going to necessarily draw the pollinators. I would look to see, like, hummingbirds and butterflies are a great example. And they're a great example because they stand out to us in their beauty. But I would look and kind of gauge what I do have or what I see in my landscape from a pollinator perspective, and then build on it. So kind of do reverse. So if I see butterflies, if I see a yellow swallowtail, maybe look up, and I think blue swallowtail. I think the blue swallowtail is the one that uses fennel, because I have probably about a 6 foot tall fennel plant in my backyard. So I know that I know that my blue swallowtail needs food. So I've got the fennel plant, so I think you really have to take a look at that and just build in reverse fashion. So, and really not destroy, their habitats like ants. We're all about destroying the ants and all about destroying their houses. Well, if they're not really bothering us, leave them alone. And that's the approach that I think we have to take. A lot of bees don't necessarily sting. One of the things that I was going to say also is that honeybees are not native to Georgia. They are from other parts of the world. So, when you see a bee in your garden, and it looks like a honeybee, it may not be a honeybee, probably is not a honeybee. It's probably a native bee. So we need to be focusing on being able to provide for our native bees. Honeybees they have such, hype out there. And I don't mean that in a negative fashion, but everybody's protecting our honeybees. That's important, but we need to protect our native bees as well.
Absolutely. I love the idea of working backwards, seeing what's already there and
Yes.
how to
Yes.
really cultivate a garden for what
Right.
is already there. That's a great tip. So if I am maybe a beginner or a non-gardener, maybe I don't have necessarily the space, are there small steps that I can take to support pollinators?
Start plants in pots. Like the Miss Huff lantana is an excellent example. And Miss Huff can grow, 3 by 3, 3 feet wide, 3 feet tall, but it has color and it attracts pollinators and it attracts many of the pollinators. And so if you're looking for color, you have a space that is hot sun, dry, put it in a pot and grow it and see. And the nice thing about Miss Huff, you can trim it to size in the wintertime, so that it's not a lot of sticks coming out of the ground. So, start with some of your smaller plants also. And I'm sitting here trying to think what I would use from a smaller plant's perspective. I would have to think about that. But, if you say, well, I don't have a green thumb, something as simple, and it's not a native plant, but something as simple as a zinnia is an excellent pollinator. So you can either plant zinnia seeds or you can buy the small zinnias and put them in a pot. So I would say individual pots for small space, depending on what your environment is like during in the most 6 hours of the day, and go from there with it.
Okay, great. Is there anything that people can stop doing to help pollinators?
Is there anything that we can stop doing
Yeah, is there
that will?
anything that a lot of people do that like maybe aren't the best for pollinators? I mean, we did touch a little bit on trying to rethink and maybe not cutting like the dandelions that are coming up. Is there anything else that maybe like the common thing like to keep up yards or gardens that we kind of do that maybe inhibit pollinators?
Um, I would probably say think twice about the trees you cut down in your landscape. One of the ones that I think about that we all love to get rid of a lot is our tulip poplars, because
Mhm.
they're so tall, and they really have very little value, but they're valuable to the pollinators because they have that bloom in the springtime. I can't tell you what pollinators that are attracted to them, but if you really kind of stop and think about it, you've got your bees, particularly that are in the springtime. So, just think twice before you prune or cut down. And that's probably my biggest thing. If it's been there and it's been there for a long time, except for wisteria, um, then think twice and think about it being a pollinator.
Okay, great. Um, are there any common misconceptions about pollinators that you hear a lot about that you would like to clear up or anything like that?
Some of the ones that we think that will sting you
Mhm.
will actually not sting you, like bumblebees, unless they are um, um, they're attacked themselves. They will try to avoid you, or just regular bees will try to avoid you. Most of the pollinators that we think are harmful to us will not bother us unless we bother them. And that's the big thing to remember. Also, one of the things as I was preparing for tonight that I learned that I didn't know, how do you tell a carpenter bee, which is a pollinator, from a bumblebee or just a traditional bee, is that the carpenter bee has a shiny um, body, whereas a regular bee is fuzzy. So if you see bees that are out, the black bees, the large bees are the ones I'm
Mhm.
particularly mentioning. If you go out in your garden and you see bees, and if you go and get a little close to them and you look for the shiny body versus the hairy body is the traditional bee, whereas the carpenter bee has the shiny body. So I thought that was kind of neat. I didn't know that.
Yeah, nice little like trick to identify. As we're
Exactly.
talking about carpenter bees, do you have any tips or anything for people who, I mean, a lot of the times carpenter bees are thought of as a nuisance, and a lot of people try and catch them. And if they're a pollinator, probably want to shy away from doing that. Is there anything that you can do to protect carpenter bees, but also maybe protecting the wood around your home? Do you have any
So,
tips? I mean, just we would love to be able to do that, wouldn't we?
yes, and I'll have to give full confession. I do have one of the bee traps for carpenter bees.
Mhm.
And yes, I catch carpenter bees because I really do not like the holes in my house. But when they bore into our house, they actually, as we know, they build the nest
Mhm.
for their babies. And Their babies are in our house at this very minute if we have not sealed those holes.
Mm.
And those babies will hatch probably in a 2 or 3 weeks, actually. And but I've kind of got a bittersweet relationship with carpenter bees now that I did the research for this, because this was one of our prep questions. I don't like them, but I know they're a pollinator.
Yeah.
And so, will I think twice about doing something about them? Yes. Will I quit doing what I'm doing? No. So, just because I hate all the holes in my house, but I'm not going to go out of my way to destroy them. And I think that's what we have to think about is everything has a life cycle.
Mhm.
And are we trying to completely eradicate something? Which, if we are, we're going to completely eradicate our butterflies, like we think we have to a degree, our hummingbirds. You
Mhm.
know, it's habitat destruction. Maybe you want to reduce the population in another way. Um, maybe you want to do nothing. I think it just really depends on how much they're destroying where we live.
Yeah.
A lot of them will actually go back. Oh, I know another thing I had learned about them is their life cycle is only about a year.
Yeah.
So it's not the same bee coming back year after year after year.
Yeah.
And so what are the chances of another bee taking over there where they've been? Could be potentially pretty good, but you know, I would say leave them alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Does anyone who's joining us have any questions? Thank you so much, Gayle, for all of your pollinator expertise. We'll see if anyone who's watching has any questions. Oh, no questions, but thank you for the info. So thank you, Gayle, again.
Right.
Yeah, there were so many good takeaways that I think are really helpful for folks who are looking to really help preserve pollinators. One of my favorite things you said was go in reverse. What pollinators do you already
Yes.
have, and how do you support them, the ones that you're already seeing? I
Yes.
love that. That's
Because you want to multiply those.
Mhm.
And there may be others that you don't see, but you want to multiply what you have. And that's kind of the way that I kind of look at it. Also, one thing, Julie, is and I wanted to mention this, the University of Georgia Extension Service has a publications page on their website. It's UGA publication, UGA extension publications, if
Mhm.
you put that in the Google search. And that is an excellent location for anyone to go and to look up information, be it on pollinators, be it on carpenter bees, be it on butterflies, anything that we've kind of mentioned and touched the surface on tonight, and anything really in gardening, period, that you're looking for is probably on that website. So I want to encourage people, in the past, before technology, we would actually mail those out to people that would call into the extension office.
Yeah.
But I think today, most of us are looking for the electronic versions of publications. And so it is UGA extension publications. So I wanted to just kind of throw that out there.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, resources are always super helpful and welcome when we're talking about these different things, especially when we kind of do overarching kind of
Right.
talk. And of course, depending on the environment that folks have, they really need to be able to kind of drill down into what would work for their yards, their gardens.
Right.
Yeah, so thank you so much. This
You're welcome.
is recorded and it will be available on Facebook and then also on our website, so people can kind of review and be able to take in this information again. This is our last one in our 3-part series. So I'm glad that we were able to end with such a great discussion about pollinators.
Sounds awesome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.